Welcome to the Millionaire Mindcast, where we broadcast weekly interviews with millionaire minds from across the globe to empower you on your journey of unlocking a rich and fulfilling life. It's time to unleash your millionaire within. Now, here's your host, Maddie A.
I'm excited to welcome my guest today, Miss Mitzi Perdue. How are we doing today?
Absolutely never better.
I gotta say, when I do the video interviews oftentimes, and now a little bit more frequently than I'd like to just because of COVID, not everybody has a nice, attractive, beautiful background behind them. And you've got a very beautiful background. Where are you tuning in from today?
I'm in Salisbury, Maryland. And this is just so deliberate. Before coming on, I was arranging the flowers just so, and like so, because why not?
Absolutely. Well, you said that you shared with me a little bit before the interview that you had a background in television. You've got a really cool journey and story, and it's very diverse and eclectic and unique. And you've learned so many things, I know, through all of the different paths and entrepreneurial journeys you've been on. Where did this start? As people ask you, who is Mitzi Perdue? How do you explain the amazing life's journey that you've experienced?
Well, I think I owe a lot of it to my parents, particularly my father. My father had such an interesting story because he started with one hotel back in the 1930s. And at the end of his life, he owned, or the family owned, 400 hotels that formed the Sheraton Hotel Corporation. So he was the founder and president of the Sheraton Hotels.
Wow.
So I got to watch a big-time entrepreneur, how he did it. And as a little girl, I discovered something wonderful. I recommend it to all little girls. There were 5 siblings. And of course, in a large family, you're all competing for parental attention. I had the perfect way to get it every time. Fail-proof. And it was to ask him about business.
There you go.
I have a sister who's adorable and cute, and she could get parental attention just by being her darling self. And another would explore spiritual things. But my royal road to attention was talking with him about why he did what he was doing and why it worked. And I loved it because it taught me things that I think you'll never read in a business book or take in a business class.
What were some of those lessons that you remember from your father that you kind of carried on into your own entrepreneurial and business journey?
Okay, I was so hoping you would ask me that. Thank you very much. Well, I used to ask him questions like, how did you make the thing grow? One hotel, and initially no employees, it was 20,000 at the time of his death. And he told me that the reason for his success was the employees at every level, whether it was a bellman or a manager. So that brings up the great big question, well, how did you get them to do such a good job? And he had an overall expression for it, which I recommend to absolutely everybody. I'm going to share with you right at the beginning the best thing that I've got.
Please.
Inspire, don't require. And I'd like to give an example of how this would play out. He told me when he'd take over a hotel, and he did begin during the Great Depression, that when he'd take over a hotel, it was usually a hotel that was like teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. And he'd invite all the employees to come into the hotel ballroom, and there might be 400 of them. There could even be 800. And he knew ahead of time that almost every single one of them was afraid that they were going to lose their job, because it's typical when a new owner comes in that he's going to take care of his uncles and nephews and cousins and give them good jobs. But Father would stand up in front of, let's say it's 400 people, and knowing that he was talking with people who were really discouraged and worried and scared, first words out of his mouth were, I want every one of you to keep your job. And I want you to keep your job because I believe in you. I know that you know your job better than anybody else in the world. And my job is to give you the resources and the encouragement to show the world just how good you are. And there's a part 2 to that story, which is he'd go on to talk about how the employees would see that, in the next few months, this is going to be the most popular, the most financially stable hotel in the whole city, and that we're going to be an example that things can turn around. You'll see. And then the next part is almost the most important part of the story. The next day, the employees would see just cavalcades of decorators and plumbers and electricians and people coming to refurbish a hotel that had gone to seed.
Mm-hmm.
But none of them went into the public areas that the paying public would see. No, they'd go into the areas where the employees were, like, for example, the employee dining rooms, lockers, showers. Father would spend the first money always on the places that the public would never see. And of course, I asked him, why did you do that? And his answer was, it was a way of communicating to the employees how important they were to him.
I love that.
Isn't that cool?
Amazing, because it really is. You succeed through others, right? It is. Yes, of course, you have to have a great product. And I was actually having this conversation with somebody the other day because I was sharing with you. I bought my first hotel up in Lake Tahoe. And yes, of course, you have to deliver a great product. But at the same time, somebody said, what are some of the things that haven't worked for you and, you shouldn't do? And I was like, I got too long of a list of those, right? You get your butt handed to you and you learn very quickly. But what I do know has worked for me is by pouring into my team, and through pouring into my team and setting standards and expectations as to what kind of culture, what core values from leadership. And really, it's not always a top-down thing. It's a collective community of creating these things together that obviously your father forecasted the vision of what that mission was, what those core values were, and what kind of culture wanted to be created. And collectively, everybody bought into that through the actions that the leader was taking. And therefore, that just rippled into, at least I've found on a very small scale compared to you guys, the experience that the customers feel when they're in the product. And that really, when those two things mold together, it creates something much bigger than just a standalone great product or standalone great team could create.
Yeah, and in the case of a hotel, the great product is the service.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, we no longer own the chain. We sold it on his death in the 1960s, but he did grow it, and he said the reason it grew was at every level the people. And when you get right down to it, the leader is the one who creates a culture of people go the extra mile.
Yes.
And if Father's believing in them and encouraging them, look where it got him. And by the way, the 1930s were a time when, how about everybody investors were running away from real estate, and particularly hotels.
Right.
And so that he could turn into a success something that everybody else was failing at. And I think he did it through just superior insight into what makes people tick.
I love that. It almost feels a little bit like the circumstances and times we find ourselves in right now. I'm on the hunt for more hotels up in Lake Tahoe because we're having some great success. And it almost feels like people are sprinting the other direction away from hospitality product and that type of real estate asset. But like you said, it comes back to almost a contrarian leader believing in themselves so much that it ultimately bleeds into the belief system of the team, whether it's hospitality or it's a business or, a sports team, right? Like that, it sounds like your father and you adopted this culture and this belief that what you guys could create was endless.
His motto was inspire, don't require. And he also, another phrase that I just treasure was, a leader's job is to give people a better vision of themselves. So he used to say, the woman making the bed in a hotel room she isn't just making the bed. She's part of a team that's building the best, most popular hotel in the city, and she's valued and cherished by management.
I love that. And when you guys sold, the hotel chain at that time, what do you think were some of the foundational principles and core values and characteristics that made your guys' business and your brand so reputable, so successful, so well known that ultimately it allowed whoever was going to take it over to continue to scale and build out even further?
You're reminding me of a story that my father told me as a little girl. And he told me that he didn't want his hotel chain to be the biggest, just wanted them to be the best. And so I endorse that. You don't have to be the biggest, but do be the best. And he put a lot of effort into that. But another aspect of it, he was very good as a family man. He spent an enormous amount of time with his children, teaching us values like that we're stewards for those who come after us, or that we should get our identity not through spending money. I mean, we don't have to have yachts and racehorses and private jets. I personally, and actually my siblings as well, when we travel, we go economy class, even if it's to China, because this came particularly from my mother, but she wanted us to get our identity from being good citizens who would give back. And my father said the greatest pleasure that his money ever gave him, and how about he had quite a lot when you have 400 hotels, he said the greatest pleasure his money ever gave him was in giving it away. Cool?
I love that. One of the things that we talk about on, the Millionaire Mindcast, and at least our community, is, it's wealth goes far beyond what dollars can buy you. And, having a bunch of zeros in your bank account is a great thing. But if your bank,
I don't object to it.
Right, of course, right. And it is something that absolutely I love making and aspiring to create more wealth and financial abundance. And if I'm financially abundant, but I'm bankrupt in my health, I'm bankrupt in, my relationships, I'm estranged from my kids, I don't give back to anybody else but myself, then that ultimately isn't the whole life millionaire. And it sounds like your father, before that term was ever really around, that was already his mentality. It's already what he believed in, and it's how he lived like a millionaire in all areas of his life, and everybody else around him felt that richness because of that.
Well, I felt when I married Frank Perdue, the chicken magnate, that he was remarkably like my father. Because when we were first getting engaged, he was 68 at the time, I was 48. And we were talking about how he wanted to spend the years that remained to him. And he lived to 85, so we had 17 years together. And he said that what was most important to him at age 68 for the years that remained to him was to be closer to his family, his community, and his church. And he really acted on those. I mean, he was extraordinarily philanthropic for the rest of his life. But he put like my father, he put huge amounts of effort into teaching the family values. And I played a role in that because I created newsletters in which I would interview him about the values that he wanted his children to have, or those who came after. And, we now have a record. I think we have 30 years of records of what Frank thought and what he wanted those who came after him, the values that he wanted for them.
That's amazing. What were some that stand out that maybe you're most proud of or feel most aligned with?
Well, his number one was be honest always. Another one was treat people with courtesy and respect, no exceptions. And I love that. Frank Perdue was an egalitarian at heart. He never felt, I don't believe that he felt in any way that he was superior to anybody else. And I'll explain why I feel that. I've watched him with several presidents of the United States, but I also got to watch dozens and dozens of times. I got to tag along through some of the processing facilities or feed mills. And I'd notice how he'd interact with the workers on the line. And I think he treated each individual with equal respect, whether it was a sanitation worker or a president of the United States. And then something else that I just admire to the outer limit. I mean, it's sort of, we're not worthy, we're not worthy. I would notice when he'd go through a plant, and this is sort of echoes of my father, but when we'd go through a plant, the number of people whom he knew by name and he'd know something about them. I mean, say it's a factory with 2,000 people and we're going through and he'd greet people by name and he'd tell me, you know, I want you to meet Delcy. Her son just got into college, or this is Peter and he hasn't had a sick day in 30 years. And, you know, imagine, Frank was just plain good at names, but imagine what it means to a worker on the line.
Yes.
That he knows them. But then the bigger part of the story was that Frank's attitude when he was talking with people, it was, you know, we're all part of the same team and we've each got our role and I infinitely respect your role.
I love that, because nowadays, now more than ever, you see some of the uproar and, you know, stigma in the corporate environment is that you're just another number, right? You're just another person in the sea of names and nobody really cares about you. And what I found in the greatest leaders is each one of them pay attention to those small little details, maybe sometimes intentionally, but also just naturally, because that's the character that has ultimately led them to being so successful, because they care and respect people on so many different levels. And that shows up not only in their interaction in a personal environment and setting, but also how they perform in a professional setting.
Well, that makes me absolutely bursting to tell another Frank Perdue story.
Please.
Because it absolutely amplifies what you were just saying. You know, I grew up in the hospitality industry, so to me, you solve everything by entertaining people. And I'm sort of kidding, but not completely. When we first got married, I told him, I announced to him, Frank, I think we should entertain every single person who works for the company in our home for dinner. And you know, he thought initially that this was a completely wacko idea. And he told, you know, at the time he employed 16,000 people. And he said, you know, that's way too many. I mean, it's just unthinkable.
Right. And
I sort of pretended that I didn't process that he had said no. And I said, and I think we should have them in groups of 100. And he said, no, that's too many. And I said, we had just gotten back from our honeymoon. I said, I bet we could start up in 6 weeks. No, that's way too soon. But as we kept talking, his attitude changed from, you know, what planet did she sit down from, to maybe there's something to it. And then finally he said, I like it. And the reason he had been hesitant was because, I mean, that's, there's no pattern for this. But 6 weeks later, we did start entertaining groups in different divisions like veterinarians, accountants, administrative assistants, truckers, everybody, and would have them in groups of 100 at a time. And they would be in our own living room. And we had a great big buffet table. And Frank Perdue would actually wait on his employees.
Wow.
And, you know, talk about servant leadership. I'm trying to say servant leadership. And yeah, what a neat, cool thing that he was willing to put up with this. And yeah, from my background, it totally suited my talent stack, because entertaining seems a really cool thing to do.
Yes.
And it was so great, because at the end of the evening, Frank would take questions from everybody, and they'd get to hear, you know, and he'd answer with extreme frankness, telling, you know, if something was good, he'd tell. If something was difficult or bad, or, I mean, he'd tell them with just as honestly as if he was talking to the board of directors. And then at the end of the evening, every evening, and that would have about 3 a month, he'd say in different words, but the bottom line would be in different words, but it would be, I know the company wouldn't be what it is today without each of you. Thank you. And I know the kind of impact that had on them, because I've been to funerals where the next of kin would tell me that the most meaningful thing in the deceased life was being invited to the big boss's home for dinner.
Wow. That's amazing. I'm curious, what incited that within you? Because obviously you didn't have to do that. You've been around so many intelligent, successful people, and you've got so much talent and success yourself. I know you got a couple superpowers that are just what make you special.
By the way, I love being interviewed by you. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. I love these. You're such a great storyteller, right? And I think that you talked about entertaining people, and people love the feeling that entertainment, the emotion that entertainment brings out of them, whether you can invite that into a professional work setting or in a movie theater or a play, right? Like, that is what many human beings live for. I'm just curious, was that something that, you just learned and picked up from being in the hospitality world and being around your dad? Or was there something else that kind of took that spark and flamed it into a wildfire?
Well, it reminds me of, I remember, again, getting parental attention, asking daddy questions. And I asked him one day, what role did mother play? And, he had actually several answers to it, but the one that's relevant to your question is, he said during the Great Depression, people were really, a depression is depressing. Yeah. I mean, people just will stipulate a depression is depressing. And he said that she used to do things like she'd say they'd taken over a hotel, and the whole city, wherever city it's in, is, in the dumps. Well, should decorate the hotel ballroom inexpensively. It might be, he told me that she'd use branches of pine that had cut from forest on our land, just to decorate the place, at almost no cost, and then invite people in. And he said, just the change of, for people getting together and having fun and appreciating each other and maybe having some adult beverages, that it just changed the atmosphere of everything. And so mother was a Southern belle, and she was just gifted at hospitality. And actually, as growing up, I wanted maternal attention as well as paternal. So I was forever asking her, what worked. And she said that one of the things that's the job of a hostess is to make the guest feel important. And she said another one of the ways of getting at that is, and she wouldn't have a set phrase, but it would be something along the lines of, and what do you think? Asking them their opinions, that how you impress somebody else is most of all how you make them feel. It's not about you boasting.
Totally. That's so true. One of my early mentors told me the most important word in the world to each person is their own name. And if you can address them with, like you said, right, that courteousness, that respect. And I love, where I just got off an interview with mutual friends that you actually were amazing and connected me with, Mark Victor Hansen and Crystal Dwyer Hansen, and their book about asking questions and how when you make it this two-way exchange instead, and whether it's talking to an employee, talking to a customer or a guest, or just an acquaintance, when you ask somebody a question and make it this two-way exchange of information, of energy, of opinion, of dialogue, whatever it is, right? There's a different human emotion and connection that can be created there. At least space can be created for that. And if you're good at what you do, like you are, like your family was, like Frank was, right? You can create something that goes above and beyond just something ordinary.
I'm coming to think that emotional connection is just one of the great forces of human nature.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'm kind of making this up as we go along because the idea just occurred to me. But what if emotional connection is one of the most important things, and you get that through hospitality, face-to-face time, and actually it can be virtual face-to-face time, but emotional connection counts.
Absolutely, especially in times like right now where people are feeling so isolated. And I know, right, you talked about kind of the Great Depression, and now we're kind of living through what, they're calling the global lockdown depression or whatever that might be. And you have co-authored an amazing book, yes, How to Be Up in Down Times, more than 1 million copies sold. And
wait, I do have to tell a story about the 1 million copies sold, because actually that is aspirational. We haven't sold 1 million copies. But one day, kind of out of the blue, Mark Victor Hansen, we're talking on the phone, and he said, Mitzi, I know that you know how to use Photoshop. I want you to take an image of our book, How to Be Up and Down Times, and I wonder if I can get close enough to show this. He said the very top line that says more than 1 million copies sold, he said, he asked me with Photoshop to put that on. And I said, why? I don't want to do false advertising. And he said, no, it's not to be false advertising. It's to focus your mind on thinking big. And he said that when you visualize things, it changes how you act. And by gosh, he's right. And I don't want to be superstitious about this, but shortly after, I printed out copies of this, and I got copies from Mark also. And he recommended that I put up copies like in the bathroom, in the office, in the kitchen, in the bedroom, everywhere. I even have it in the stairwell, so there's no way that I can go from downstairs to upstairs without this staring me in the face, more than 1 million copies sold. And the end result is, well, here's the superstitious part. Shortly after I did that, I got a woman that I've never met from Taiwan told me that she had bought 200 copies for her friends from Taiwan. But that's not the end of the story. She wanted to know if she has a bunch of stores in Taiwan, and she wanted to know what kind of break we could give her to sell 1,000 copies. So what if visualizing really has an impact? But then it has, that's my superstitious side, which I'm about ready to believe in. But then there's something else, which is, every time I face that more than 1 million copies sold, it makes me start thinking, what else can I do? Mm. And it's something that I recommend to absolutely everybody. Visualize whatever it is that you're looking for.
Yes.
And, maybe even print it out and write it up and print it out and look at it. You're in the bathroom, in the bedroom, wherever.
No, that's so true. I always, I always tell people, as I tell myself as well, when I write out my goals for my 90-day sprints, I put them up I laminate them and I put them in my gym bag. I have them on my desk. I have them on my mirror. I have them in the car. And it's one of those things where, when you're in proximity to the things that matter most, your brain and the awareness piece, your reticular activating system is engaged and turned on to what's important to you. Therefore, you go to work and finding ways of creating that vision into an actual physical, tangible reality for yourself, right?
And that makes me think of something that my father told me also, which this is the superstitious side again, but he told me that there were like maybe 6 or 8 times when if Sheraton had gone one way, the company would fail. If it would go another way, it would absolutely prosper. And he'd go to bed at night having absolutely no idea what to do. He'd wake up in the morning, and he said, and I don't know whether he was exaggerating or being metaphoric or whether he really literally meant this, but he said he felt as if he had talked with his ancestors like in a dream. And he'd wake up with total clarity of which way to go, and it worked. Wow. So putting stuff inside your mind and mulling it over, your unconscious mind is working on it, even if you're not consciously thinking about it.
Always. Yes, always. And so I know there's probably a lot of people who might be a little bit down as they listen to this podcast, or at the end of the day, we all know we've had those peaks and those valleys, and they're evident that they're 100% going to happen, especially if you're someone that is always pushing for a bigger life or more money or furthering your career or a better relationship or more health. There's always pain that comes a part of that process and that path. What are maybe 1 or 2 things that, really stand out to you in the book on how to be up in those down times that, might be a good teaser as to what else they might find inside your book?
Well, a very short answer is, yeah, life does have pain in it, and you're paying your dues. So just don't expect to get out scot-free.
Yes.
But let me try something more helpful than that. I mean, actually, I hope that is helpful. But I have a story in the book that has to do with Napoleon Bonaparte and Mother Teresa. And completely by accident, there's a period where in the space of 1 week, I read a biography of Napoleon and one about Mother Teresa. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France and conqueror of a good bit of Europe, he had all the money, all the status, all the material goodies. How about all the women? He had what you would think would be all the goodies that life has to offer, probably more than any man ever before or since. I mean, he just ruled the world. Mm-hmm. And money poured in, palaces, everything. When he was in exile and towards the end of his days, he wrote that when he looked over at his whole life, he couldn't count 5 happy days. All that wealth, money, status, power, fame didn't bring happiness. But then there's Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa, as a Catholic nun, had a vow of both poverty and humility. And with her vow of poverty, she owned the following possessions. And I know this because she wrote about it in her book. She owned 3 cotton saris, that Indian robe, and the sandals on her feet. That was the beginning and the end of her earthly possessions. She, with her vow of poverty and with humility, she would, and I'm going to use another direct quote from her, she would eat the bread of the poor, so that unless she was at some fancy banquet fundraising or something, she would be eating what poor people ate. So she had an extraordinarily humble and possession-free life. And so what kind of happiness came from that approach to life? I have a quote from her in which she says, "My life has been a feast of unending joy." Mm. So which is going to take you farther? Her life was a life of giving. Napoleon's life was a life of taking. And this is a quote from Frank Perdue that I think sums up the whole thing. If you want to be happy, think what you can do for somebody else. If you really want to be miserable, think what's owed to you.
I love it.
So I recommend, and when I look at my own life, the times when I'm really miserable and resentful and want to punch somebody, sweet little me, you wouldn't guess it. But it's when I feel that I'm owed something and it's been unfair. I mean, that I'm miserable. When I'm thinking of something generous, boy, I'm usually feeling up.
Yes. And that's just one amazing lesson that I know are riddled inside how to be up in down times. Guys, be sure to go over to millionairemindcast.com, and all the links to the book on Amazon, as well as Mitzi's contact information will be on there. But if somebody does want to go and buy the book now or check out more about you, your story, where they can find more information, where should we send them?
The easiest, I have 2. Oh, how confusing. But here goes. MitziPerdue.com. And if they want to contact me, there's a contact form there.
Perfect.
And if MitziPerdue.com, if you don't feel like remembering that, I have another website with very similar information, except that it focuses on the book. And it's called AuntMitzi.com. And Aunt is not the little thing that crawls around. It's like an uncle. So AuntMitzi.com.
Perfect. Well, we'll be sure to include that on the website. Guys, be sure to check that out. If you enjoyed this episode today, go and buy the book. There's going to be some amazing lessons in there because you're going to need to put them into action at some point in time. I'm excited to dig in and read it. Mitzi, it's been an absolute pleasure getting to hang out with you, and I just love the stories. I'm inspired. If I get to 400 hotels one day, I will be a happy man. But more importantly, if I have my daughters, because I have a few, talking about me the way you talked and admired about your father, that's more of a success than anything. And so I
would, for my own personal life goals, I'd rather have my kids have a really great relationship with me than all the money in the world. And I think I've got that. I mean, my 2 sons are my life.
I love it. Well, I think they got a pretty damn good mom. So I appreciate you and your time today. And thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.